When people think of autism, they picture a kid who loves trains, maybe doesn't make eye contact, maybe even some sort of like a quirky genius, amazing at music, something like that. But what if I told you that autism doesn't always look like that? What if it means that you get exhausted after you're socializing and you still enjoyed socializing when you were doing it? Or what if it means that you're repeating the same song over and over in the car the entire drive, or watching the same three comfort shows for years? Today, we're diving into the unexpected and overlooked but valid ways that autism can show up for people, especially adults, women, and people who've masked their whole lives. So, if you've ever wondered, is this autism or is this just sort of a TikTok fad? Stick around because this episode might change how you view neurodivergence.
So, if we look through the DSM criteria when it comes to like autism spectrum disorder, right? We can kind of go through how each one is more nuanced than what the words say, and maybe talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So, in their first criteria, A, it says persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, as manifested by the following. Currently or by history, examples are illustrative, not exhaustive, see text. That just right there tells you, like, hey, we're saying a lot of things, but also it can be a lot of other things. And this is why it's important for us to kind of research, listen, go through the different nuance so that we know what that means, that they're just illustrated. And that's all that there's other options. So the first one is deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions, or affect to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. So it's like a really broad range of how somebody interacts socially. And it also, like anything else, requires context because as a practitioner, you're looking at this going, oh, this seems like an abnormal social approach. But are we basing that off of what is truly abnormal, what we think is abnormal, what's different from the way that we socialize, right? So there's a lot of things that you have to assess about yourself in order to understand what an abnormal social approach even is, what reciprocity should or should not look like, all of these things. So even if somebody appears as if they are back and forth conversating with you, is there points of time where they are potentially thinking a lot about how they are giving you that reciprocity, right? Is there moments of pause where you're not sure, are they going to say something, but then they say something and it's totally normal. So you're like, oh no, they're not socially awkward. They just needed a moment to think about that thing. This can look different ways in different people. And it's not always just, oh, hey, I'm really socially awkward and it's very obvious, right? It's not always like that. This can all happen internally inside of somebody's brain if we don't ask them the questions of what happens inside of their mind when they socialize. We may not ever get to a place where we feel there is any abnormal socializing going on.
And I think this is like if you back up to like even what happens before the social interaction. So a lot of people are rehearsing social interactions. They have scripts about what to say. They know like the hey, how are you? What's up? What's going on? And that sounds very fluid and very normal because it's rehearsed and it's scripted. And then sometimes people have lists in their phone about like what are the things to talk about if there is a silence. So it feels like they're very extroverted and comfortable to socialize with. It doesn't feel awkward because they've essentially like created this demeanor or this personality that is able to thrive in a social situation. But that comes with a lot of research and that can be really exhausting for people. And that's what a lot of people do mean by like masking, right? Like as you said, like internally there's like so much stuff going on of like, okay, now they stop talking. What do I say next? Like, how do I respond to that? Like, just analyzing every single, like, everything about that conversation in order to maintain it. And that's like a lot of work.
Well, and not even just what they're saying, but also, what their bodies are doing. And that comes a little bit later in the conversation, but like that's just one aspect of the planning that goes into socializing for somebody who is highly masking. And I've even had people tell me that they'll go on like ChatGPT and they'll
Yes.
ask it to take a statement and make it more, social or more diplomatic if it's a work setting or like, and have other people or resources and tools help them with this scripting because they can't figure it. Like, if you really think about the amount of time that takes up out of somebody's life, out of their day, and why it's like, oh, this event isn't until 7 p.m., but I need to spend all day prepping for it. And so my whole day is shot because I have a 1 hour meeting at 7 p.m. It's like, that's exhausting.
Accurate. Yeah. And then sometimes it's like even some people are too blunt and like we could just like assume that they're assholes. But like they're not an asshole, they're just blunt and that's how they navigate social conversations. But we're not ever like backtracking and thinking about like maybe they're autistic and that's why they're answering in this way. Or like why are they continuously like asking for more information about my questions? Again, that's like they're not understanding the typical social interaction and they need more information, right?
Well, and also I find that highly masky people are typically pretty humorous. And so
Yes.
it may cover for that awkwardness or that like, oh, they seem like an asshole by like following it up with like a self-deprecating joke
Yep.
or,
Sarcasm.
something where it even furthermore helps to make other people comfortable with the awkwardness, even though the person experiencing it is so fucking uncomfy. Right.
Accurate, accurate. So the next one, deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication, abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures, to lack of facial expressions and nonverbal communication. So again, like range, as you said, range, right? Like it doesn't mean that you are just not having facial expressions. It could also mean that they are exaggerated. Like you could be watching anime and then using those facial expressions in things. So you might have somebody like a kid, I've seen this before in kids who love anime and like if they're surprised or excited about something, they do the jaw drop. So they're like thinking that their jaw is actually dropping and that's like what they're imagining and how they're showing it, right? But that's like a huge indicator.
Yeah.
What else you got for that?
Well, and I think a lot of this too, like with the body language, right? There's a lot of thought that goes into what does it mean if I cross my arms? So do they think I'm mad? Maybe let me put them down by my sides. No, wait, I look like a robot. This also happens with eye contact too, right? Like you said before, it's not always that, oh, I can't make eye contact or my eye contact is really avoidant. And then I awkwardly look at you and then look away again, right? In somebody who has really well thought out these things about themselves throughout their whole life, a lot of it's going to be like, okay, now I'm still looking at them and making that eye contact. And I'm going to, okay, I'm back now, like really thinking about don't make it weird for them. So make sure that this meets the context of the conversation I'm having. And this may be rehearsed ahead of time and maybe something that's just like at the forefront of somebody's mind during a conversation. It may be something that changes based on the other person's form of eye contact, right? So kind of mimicking what other people are doing in that setting, like what is the right amount of eye contact to make or not make. And that may not always come across as awkward to you, especially if they are mimicking your eye contact as a practitioner. I'm not going to say, oh, that's awkward that they're doing that if they're just doing what I'm doing, which sometimes I like to look out the window because there's like fun stuff out there, right? Like, so if they look away, I'm going to be like, oh, that's totally normal because
That's
they
what I
do it
do.
like I do it.
Yep. Or like they're like looking right into your eyes, like into the depths of your soul, because they literally think like I was told that I had to have eye contact growing up. So like let me look into your eyeballs. But then like there's always like the conscious thinking of like how much should I be blinking? But as a practitioner we need to like be asking about the background of what is happening behind these social conversations and like these social interactions. That's a big
Just
deal.
because the surface looks one way doesn't mean that there's not an entire shit show dumpster fire happening inside of somebody's brain.
Exactly. And like even with like nonverbal communication, like how do you sit in an appointment? Like I'm over here sitting cross-legged, right? Like I can't sit in any sort of a professional environment with my legs down. I'm cross-legged. I'm on the floor. I'm like, kind of like hunched over sometimes. And those are some of like the weird abnormal we see too, that we're like, oh, not necessarily like sitting straight up in a chair, having a normal conversation. Like things can look a little bit more stiff sometimes, or sometimes not.
Well, and I get a lot of descriptors from people about like how uncomfy it feels to just like be inside of a body, right? And so this can also impact that body language aspect of like trying to practice and find things that are like comfortable enough, but look okay to other people, that they're not weird, right? Like I can't sit on the floor during a board meeting, but I can, curl my foot up under my bum during a board meeting and then maybe like, find ways to get a little bit more comfy. But it's not necessarily going to be ideal, but can still be shown to other people as like kind of normal.
I like how you refer to the body as a meat suit, and I think that is like a great thing. Like, do you feel like your body is a meat suit? Like, are you just kind of manipulating the meat to kind of like slap it around a little bit and like stay comfortable in this like really uncomfortable costume kind of thing?
Yeah, like just essentially like how do I make the Play-Doh meat suit look like the other people's meat suits look in this room so that they think I belong here and am not, you know, fucking weird for lack of a better way to describe it, you know? And this is a common experience that people have when it comes to um, especially like level one autism where you're like really, really focused on how to maintain normalcy or
Yes.
whatever.
How do I not out myself kind of thing, that I'm
Yeah.
weird and that I'm different than everyone else?
Yeah.
Accurate. Third thing would be deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships, ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behaviors to various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or making friends, to the absence of interest in peers. What you got for your take?
There's a lot to unpack there. Like especially if we're talking specifically about like adults, uh, women, people who have, you know, trauma, right? There's things that cause somebody to behave differently in social settings. And depending on like how you are socialized growing up, too, like what types of contexts were you made to be appearing comfortable in, right? So when you're developing these relationships, especially as a girl, right, you see other people like, ooh, we are playing dolls and we are into fashion and into these things that like really make no fucking sense to me because I'm like, we're meat suits floating on a rock in space. Why do we care? Right. But being able to learn how do I kind of navigate this, but then not fully feeling like sameness to others in those settings and trying to kind of come to terms with what that means. That imaginative play piece, I think that you talk a lot about that in a way that's awesome, but like it can look imaginative, but it's about these realistic things. What do you think about that?
So yeah, like my daughter is a prime example where I kept telling myself like, no, she can't be autistic. She does so much pretend play. But the pretend play was like, I'm playing doctor. This is the stethoscope, right? Like I'm going to check the heart now. And all of her imaginative play comes from shows. So like it's all rescue situations. So we're always rescuing a car that's stuck on top of a building or something like that. And the cars are doing it and they're rescuing each other and like they're talking to each other and it seems to be imaginative, but then I started noticing that a lot of it is scripts from shows she was watching and she's using like different parts from shows to make up this pretend play. So it feels pretend, but there's no dragons appearing or like anything that she hasn't seen before. Like nothing is stemming directly from her imagination. It's all stemming from things she's seen. And it might be play around like I'm going to play doctor because I just went to the doctor, or I'm going to play work. I see my mommy working all the time, things like that. So even like in pretend play, a lot of the time it goes to the point of like people are setting up their doll houses or setting up a scene, and then they just look at it and they're like, mm-hmm. And then they'll move on to the next thing. Whereas somebody who's neurotypical would actually continue the play. Once that's set up, they would continue doing the pretend play. But people who are autistic just set it up and leave it there because they're satisfied. Or there might be like lining things up in a specific way and kind of checking it out and be like, yeah. And then you're doing imagination and kind of talk in your head, but it's not coming out into the play anymore. It's just kind of like, okay, I put the scenario in my head and it's here now. So I think that's where girls get misdiagnosed a lot because, well, they pretend play, but do they? Right? Or like if even in the ADOS, right? Like when we did the ADOS on my daughter, blowing out birthday candles, she's seen birthday candles before. She's done like blowing out candles. So yes, that's a realistic situation that she can pretend to blow out candles because that's criteria. Does that mean she pretends plays? No. She still doesn't get it. That's a realistic scenario. That doesn't count.
Right. Yeah, there's no piece of imagination that has to be used for something that you have a real context to draw from, right?
Right.
And I think too, this goes into adulthood in terms of the relationships too, like the social aspect of interacting with other people, or you know, the a version of play that happens in adulthood, right? Being at a party, socializing with other people, like that people oftentimes have either, no big interest in this, or in the moment it feels really fun, but afterwards there's a lot of nitpicking of like, why did I hold my body in that way? How come I didn't say it this way? Was that weird that I did it that way? And then not wanting to like reach out and ask all your friends, like, hey, was it weird when I did that one hand movement? Did everybody think my hand looked really big? Right? Disproportionate to my body. These are not the things that we assume other people are thinking about when they are at some type of fun social gathering, right?
And that's not social anxiety. And that's kind of like where the difference is like social anxiety, like, isn't you're nitpicking everything that you did wrong and kind of like misinterpreting how other people interpreted it, basically. And even like with relationships and romance, that kind of comes in with getting obsessive about your partner or thinking you have to people please and not understanding how to maintain relationships. Or, if you get into a fight with a partner, you might just think like the relationship's over and just pack up their things and be like, okay, I guess we're broken up now, because you just don't understand. And you can develop some sort of like abandonment trauma about that if you don't see those things coming. So there's a lot of weird, nuanced ways in there with relationships. I feel like that's pretty endless.
Well, and yeah, I think too, this is a great example of how this can be important for clinicians to know, even if you're not going to be diagnosing autism. Like, it's important to know that these things are common in autism, so that if somebody's like checking a bunch of boxes for like borderline personality disorder,
Yep.
just because there's a history of unstable relationships doesn't necessarily mean that it's based out of this like personality disorder. It may be based out of a much larger web of fuckery happening in this person's brain every time that they are trying to get close or be more intimate with another human being.
It looks like fearing abandonment because like they can't keep friends, and that's why they can't keep friends since childhood. This isn't like an adult trauma developed thing. This is like, I could never ever keep friends. What's wrong with me? So of course I'm going to be fearing that, and like of course I'm very reactive with social situations, and of course they're triggering because it's traumatic.
Well, and if you ask somebody like, are these relationships abruptly ended because of something you did, right? If you're thinking of like borderline type of stuff, like, oh, were you being dramatic and you just were like, we're not friends anymore, the person might say like, yes, it's because of something I did. But if you go ask the friend that they just like, or the boyfriend that they left, right, they might say, yeah, one day like she just left and it was so weird because like I thought we were fine and I just never heard from her again. And so it wasn't a big dramatic thing. It was just a misinterpretation of that social cue.
So many of those. And I feel like that could get pushed as borderline so often. That's so true. That's like where the borderline disparity happens, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. And think about the ways that impacts somebody to be told like you have borderline versus, hey, this is an autistic trait. Let's dig more into that,
Yeah. Like there are a lot of people who say like, but I don't have trauma, but I think I have borderline, would make me question like, genetics. You know what I mean? Like, is there autism somewhere in here?
Mm-hmm.
The sprinkles of maybe.
Yeah.
All right, next up we have B. So restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities as manifested by at least two of the following, currently or by history of. And again, examples are not exhaustive, right? So first one, repetitive motor movements, use of objects, speech. So things like simple motor is it stereotypies? Am I saying it right? I hope I am. I jack up words and then I get corrected on TikTok all the time. So lining up toys, flipping objects, echolalia, idiosyncratic phrases. So echolalia is probably one of the most common ones, and I think people automatically assume it means like, oh, it's that little boy who's running around like quoting things, or like I just said that and now he's like repeating it for half an hour, but they're missing the subtleties that like can be sometimes when you're talking to an adult, they repeat it and it's not even out loud, but they're repeating it and then they will answer you. Or palilalia, which isn't even listed in here, which is when you say something and like for instance, my daughter does this a lot. She would say like, the train is coming. The train is coming. So she's repeating herself. So kind of like a version of echolalia. And then it can be internal too, right?
Yeah, it can be like, hearing that same line in a song over and over in your brain, and then you have to listen to the song to get it out of your brain. Now, obviously, that's something that like could be a million different things, but if we're asking enough questions, this is how we start to help people identify like, what is it that's causing this thing that I'm experiencing that's causing me to feel distressed sometimes or just really confused by how my brain works.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of the like repetitive motor movements, I think the most stereotyped thing that we think about is, historically, like what you were talking about at the beginning, right? Kids who are just really into trains and having these big stimming behaviors that are repetitive, right?
Lining up the trains.
Yeah, it's not necessarily going to look like that, especially for people who have either had to mask or have learned to mask or are going to find ways to fit in so that they can function, especially as adults, right? And so some of these repetitive motor movements might not be things that you even see. It might be moving your toes inside of your shoes,
crossing your toes, pressuring your
playing with your hair,
fingers,
crossing your toes. Yeah.
cheek biting is a favorite over here.
Cheek biting, like tapping on things in a way that's like, just seems like, oh yeah, I'm really into like music and rhythms, but like it's actually like scratching that itch of I need to repeat these things to get that sensory feedback, tactile feedback, all of these things.
Yeah. And then with that too, like a lot of people don't talk about the idiosyncratic phrases, but that one is kind of like these are like self-created expressions, right? So like they're different than like common meanings. So like my daughter, for example, uses green means go. And she does this when we're in traffic. And for the longest time I used to just be like, no, it's red. The light is red. And I didn't understand that she was just like mentioning that we were in traffic. And that was just her way to mention it. So now I understand. I'm like, oh, yes, we're in traffic. But for a long time, I just didn't understand. So sometimes people are kind of just giving these phrases that you're like, what? What's the relevance? Or like it might have some relevance and you just think they're joking. So you laugh it off. But those can kind of pop in and out of places too. So that's important to be kind of like assessing. And then like what do girls do for repetitive lining things up, right? Lining up pencils and getting irritated if somebody takes them out, like lining up colors in a certain way. Grocery stores, if they're like in the checkout line, like fixing things, OCD, or is it autism? That's kind of your jam too.
Yeah. Well, and that's like when we get to this next one here, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns, or verbal and nonverbal behavior, extreme distress at small changes, difficulties with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, needing to take same route or eat food every day. Like, just like anything else in mental health, like these things can be more than one thing. And so being able to identify some of this in a way that's more nuanced allows us to search for meaningful answers and not just an answer to put in a chart to bill insurance, right? Um, all of that, the ritualized things, routines, needing the sameness, it has to be done this way. This can all be OCD as well. This could also be ADHD, right? If I need things to be in the same place every time, or else I'll forget them or lose them.
Right.
That can be a whole nother basket of
like
symptoms.
Is it a system somebody's made to just cope, right?
And so figuring out what is the reasoning behind this behavior. Can I get this person or somebody who knows them really well to describe why this happens for them? If I need that routine because this is just the way that it is, this is just the way that makes sense. Like it just works this way. This is how I do my laundry because this is what I was taught and this is what works for me. We can even look at that and say, oh, well, there are certain aspects of that kind of behavior where if you have a routine that's not distressing to you, but maybe makes other people frustrated, you could even say like, oh, is this obsessive compulsive personality disorder?
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
being particular kind of thing.
being able to really look at each of these pieces and say, what is it? Is it because this is just that rigid sameness routine piece of autism, or is there other aspects to it? Right. And is there other criteria also? Because it's not just saying, oh, this is this one thing and that means you have autism. It's like when we go down all of these and we're able to look at all of them to say, do we need enough of these to say, hey, this might be autism?
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
know?
that's a good point. And then like people think I think it's so rigid sometimes that it can't be messed with. But they're like, do you have a routine that you follow every day? It doesn't necessarily mean that autistic people are following a routine. It might be that they just watch the same show before they go to bed every night, or like they read the same book over and over and over again, or they're just listening to the same song for, a 3 hour car ride and they're like pumped up by it. It's kind of like a form of stimming in a way. It's just kind of regulating you, right? The transition thing too, like but you're transitioning fine. And it's like, but how much effort goes into transitioning from me being dry to wet to getting into a shower? Like, do I need to mentally prep myself to go to do that transition. Like, what about the transition from like eating to not eating? You know, there's just like all these like weird little nuance things that people think like transition must mean like getting up in the morning and going to work, like home to school. But sometimes it's like bed to not bed, bed to up. Like, what is that transition like? Is it hard to get out of bed? Depression? Autism?
Right.
You know?
Well, and I think also with like the greeting rituals and stuff, I mean, is it a ritual because if I don't say goodbye to you in a certain way, I feel like you might die, and then we are never going to talk again, and it'll be my fault because I didn't say it that way? That would fall more in our OCD bucket, right? Yeah. But if it's like I've been socialized by the people in my life that when we are leaving a setting, I say, bye, I hope you have a nice day. Mm-hmm. And if you don't say that back to me, it's like, but wait, you aren't following the script. And it feels really rigid and routine like that as like a, hey, this is our greeting ritual or our goodbye ritual. If someone doesn't follow that script with me, it can be really confusing, frustrating, overstimulating, or understimulating, right?
Feeling like that person hates you and then overthinking it kind of thing.
Yeah, they definitely hate you if they didn't follow the script.
Yeah, they're mad at me. Like they're not like, you know, communicating back. Like my daughter who wants to play with this boy and he told her no because he's autistic and he just didn't want to play with her. So he's being too blunt. And she's like, why? Why does he hate me? I'm like, buddy, I'm so sorry.
She's like, I finally made an attempt.
She's like, we have the same script we do, Mom. We rehearse this all the time and you always say yes. And it's like, man, I guess I gotta mix that up. I mean,
start throwing new scripts in there.
Gotta make some new scripts over here for social situations. But yeah, it kind of runs into that. The greeting ritual one is interesting. Or like, do I always shake a hand kind of thing? Do I not know what to do with rituals? Because I don't usually hug, and then people want to hug, and I'm like, what do I do? That's different, and you kind of freak out internally because someone's trying to hug you all of a sudden.
Yeah. Can't relate at all. Never.
Not like I had to prep not to prep her office manager not to hug you, and she was so concerned. She's a hugger. She's like, what do I do?
Listen, I like a hug if I know what kind of hug is coming my way and what I'm supposed to do in response. Okay, are we a deep hug? Is this like a side hug? What is happening?
You don't want to hug wrong back. That would be bad. I mean, you know, obviously.
You need to know what to expect.
Oh my God.
I can practice the script.
But we don't seem autistic.
No, not at all.
No. Don't worry, guys. We don't relate to any of this. All right, next up we have highly fixated restricted interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, so strong attachment or preoccupation with unusual objects, circumscribed, or different kind of interests like that. So,
oh yeah.
One of the big things I've noticed with this is like sometimes the stuffed animals, people can have an unusual attachment to stuffed animals, and this is wildly common for autistic people. So being like, my stuffed animal has feelings, I don't want them to feel left out, or like, let me make social media for my stuffed animal, and like they have feelings and they have like their own friends and things like that. Or like feeling like your car has feelings. My daughter seems to think that our car has feelings. She's always asking how he feels. Did you miss me? She kisses him, you know, all of the things. But also a car girl for the restricted interests.
Yeah, well, and I think these can be things that are also really like celebrated aspects of people, and so it doesn't feel like, I think a lot of times when we use the train example, right, it's like, oh, this is a really nerdy thing that somebody's like way too into and like spending too much time, but it can also be something that's really positive that brings them a lot of, you know, career success or just socialization success, right? If somebody's able to get really deeply into something and know a lot of things about it, it can be a good thing about them. And so I think we look at this as like, what's your thing? What are you into that's like wasting your time or is silly to me or whatever? But these restricted fixated interests can also be really positive things too. And then we aren't always looking for stuff like that. Because I think a lot of what we learn, especially in psychiatry, is how are we going to fix this problem for this person?
Exactly.
This isn't always a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it is their profession, right? Like my thing is to nerd out on psychiatry. Like that is literally what I love. I love psychology.
Brains, not trains.
All of it. Sociology, like social justice. But like those things are just like conversational things and things in current events. But like literally, like that's all I want to read. Nonfiction books about these things. And that's all I'm interested in. And that's all I really want to talk about. So when people want to have superficial conversations, I'm like, but what about all these bigger things? So, but like nobody's going to ask me that if I go in for an autism evaluation. They're going to say, do you have any like special collections of things? I don't know, really. I don't know. Do you have any fixated interest on like trains or anything? Not any objects. So it's different, right?
Yeah. Well, and it's things that we may not even realize are those things, right? Like I have a family member that collected yogurt tops in the drawer of the bathroom, right? This is not a normal behavior, but it's also not something that you're going to be like, oh, is your special interest collecting yogurt tops in the drawer of your bathroom as a child?
Would not be an
Like, that's
example.
right. It's just,
It's so
it's not,
obscure, like you wouldn't think to ask, and honestly, like it's so normal to them that they wouldn't think to answer is the thing.
yeah.
Like they're
Yeah. It was
like,
just
so
a thing they did.
yeah, it's just normal. Like, doesn't everyone collect things?
Right.
Kind of thing.
Well, and I think too, if we look at like all of the like, there's a lot of jokes about it, but like tons of undiagnosed autistic boomers that have like hoarder houses that have collections of all types of shit.
Dude, that's so
It's just
accurate.
like, oh, well, they're really I don't even know. They have special things that they like a lot. China cabinet, right? Like,
It's just the china cabinet, you know,
it?
all the expensive china that makes no sense, that is untouched because you can't touch it. It's in its place.
We've never used it.
Yeah, actually, all the little quirky things, or they have like old school dolls, and it's like just because they're old when I was a child, and they're all like lined up.
Or
Mm-hmm.
like a whole shitload of tchotchkes that are like inside, like size order, color order.
Yes, dude. And like I think like some of it too is like what was I gonna say? Celebrities is like another thing that like young girls or even like adults get really into, and they're like collecting fan things. I don't know, football or basketball or sports could be a huge one that's missed because it's like, no, they're just a sports fan, and it's like, no, they're fucking obsessive
No, they
about it.
know every single stat of every single player, height, weight, what position they play, what teams they've been on, who was the greatest in that position ever, like
All
what was
the things.
what was their record last season and the 17 seasons before that. Like,
And they're like info dropping on you, and you just are kind of like, I don't understand any of this, and they don't even notice. They're just like continuously info dropping, like so excited, right?
this is also so socially acceptable, right? And if you look at even, I don't know about you, but if anybody in your life has a TikTok algorithm that's like, here's all these sports people that talk about sports, like these people are making really good money
Tons.
talking about sports. And so, again,
Tons.
it can be a really positive thing for them. And especially if it's something that's socially acceptable to really like nerd the fuck out on that doesn't seem nerdy to other people because it's sports and we're bros and bros love sports.
Accurate. Or like
It's not as
certain,
weird as nerding out on brains or trains or
yeah,
anime or
singers and stuff like that. Oh, like she's just into like pop stars or like, Taylor Swift or whatever it is. And it's like, yeah, but like when you're that deep into it and it's like your whole life, it's like, when does it kind of cross into autism territory, right?
oh, yeah. And I think it's a whole you have to look at all of the things combined, right? Because you can be non-autistic and be obsessed with Taylor Swift or
Absolutely.
whatever, right?
Or the NFL.
Or the NFL, right? But how many of these other criteria are we like hitting
Yep.
without a doubt? You know?
And like one of
Uh,
the big ones I think is the sensory issue. So I'll give that one to you.
oh yeah, so like hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input or unusual interests in sensory aspects of the environment, like apparent indifference to pain or temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascinations with lights or movement. Now, again, I think when you hear all of those things, it's a very like stereotyped version of these things, but there's so much that goes into this. Another big plug for like occupational therapy in this regard, because
Yes.
a lot of these things are things that we don't necessarily notice about ourselves unless somebody helps to point it out, right? If your body has always felt this way with specific stimuli or one of the things that they'll look at too is like interoception, right? Like how
Yes.
much do I recognize about what's happening inside of my body? Do I know when I have to pee, or am I just like all of a sudden, oh my gosh, I haven't peed all day, I have to pee,
Which
right?
also these kids end up later potty trained. So like as an adult, you should ask your parent when you got potty trained because, you know,
Yeah.
might be some insight there. And also like emotional regulation, you ask them about emotions or just anything like hunger, I don't know is always the answer. And they feel pressured by those questions because they literally don't know. They don't understand hunger. So sometimes we get overeating and sometimes we get diagnosed with eating disorders because again, we're not recognizing hunger. So we just don't eat.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's restricted on what we're eating. So we're like, well, they're restricting. But it's like, no, they literally have like three safe foods.
Yeah. This can also happen with like the way that clothing feels on your skin. And you may not recognize, like, oh, when I wear, really tight jeans, it makes me feel trapped and irritable and all of these things. And so somebody may present as, oh, they're super irritable and they have this like mood disorder going on. But then if they're wearing sweatpants, they don't display any of that.
Right.
Like helping somebody identify what it is that's actually kind of the trends and why they feel the way that they do. And is that something internally in their body or a response to an external stimuli or a lack of response to external stimuli?
Yeah, and I think that's where we get like a lot of NPs and people don't necessarily understand like the sensory stuff, and they kind of like bring it back to like, well, if you're bothered by loud noises, you're covering your ears as a kid. What does that look like in an adult? That looks like irritability, kind of as you said. Like pain processing, like what does it look like if you get hurt? Are you like thinking that you broke your toe because you stubbed it every single time you're falling over, or do you just get bruises everywhere because you don't notice and you're like super clumsy? Are you like going outside when it's like super cold out, not wearing a jacket because you just don't feel cold? That's a thing. Or like feeling like overheated or just too cold at everything, so you're constantly bundling up. But
Yeah.
there's just so many like weird little nuanced things that like people aren't looking at the variations.
Yeah.
Clothing, as you said, like is a really big one. Tags, it's kind of like the most common one.
Sock seams. Oh my gosh, I hear
Socks.
so many people talk about sock
Yep.
seams.
Or just like how do they fit? Like, do I break holes into my shoes because I'm like constantly like stimming with my toes and breaking holes into them, and I hate socks because of it?
Yeah.
Or
Or like, do you walk around barefoot or do you always have socks on? Right? Like,
yeah, or shoes. Like some people can't take their shoes off because it's weird.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of variation and nuance to that, right? Because it's not always about what it feels like on your skin, more so, what kind of tactile input is it giving you? Does it feel better if there's like something holding your meat suit together on your feet, right?
The
Uh,
deep pressure on the meat suit.
right. Again, this can overlap with some of that more like OCD stuff. Do I not want the contamination of something being on my foot and my skin from, outside or whatever? So I wear a sock or a shoe. Or is it
Yeah.
more that, either sensory, I don't like what it feels like when carpet touches my toes, or
Yeah.
do I want something that's like holding it together?
The sticky thing too is like something on OCD questionnaires, like if you don't like sticky things, but that's often a sensory issue. Is like I don't want to touch things that are sticky, or I crave it, one or the other. So
It
that's a
has to
big
be a
thing.
certain type of sticky. A lot of
Sticky
times what I'll hear
wet.
from people is like, yes, I hate loud noises unless I chose what the noise
Yes.
is.
Like
Or I
my
hate
music.
stuff. Yeah,
Yes.
unless it's a certain type of slime that I really like. Or a certain type of texture. And so it's not always like, oh yeah, I hate these specific textures. It's sometimes I hate it and sometimes I don't. And this is why.
So, for the most part, we covered all of the criteria and some of the unconventional ways that things can show up. Some of the things that we did not mention would be empathy and demonstration of empathy. So, looking at hyperempathy occurring, a lot of clinicians assume that if you experience empathy, then you cannot be autistic. But there's kind of like a spectrum on that too, where people can experience none. There's people who experience it but don't know how to show it, so they come across as cold, right? But they just don't even know how to feel it, recognize the feeling, or express it. And then there's the people who have hyper empathy. And there is a study on this from, I think, Sheffield in the UK that looks at the experiences of autistic women, and kind of descriptors of empathy. And there are people who describe feeling like physical pain, overwhelmed with anger, grief, a deep sad feeling. It feels like my innards are being twisted. So there is a level of empathy that can occur that can be actually crippling. And that can be kind of a way that social interactions are perceived that, again, isn't neurotypical standard that we're not often talking about. The other thing is looking at like queer, trans folk, and how gender presents. So we get a lot of like people who don't want to dress in gender normative ways and kind of like questioning gender norms. And if you imagine like all of the social thought and effort that goes into following and understanding gender norms, that can be really hard for somebody who's neurodivergent. So we often see that there's a large population who are trans or who are non-binary, who are asexual, and that whole spectrum is much more common. And I think more easily explored for people who don't necessarily fall in with the social norms, right? So I think overall, a lot of the criteria is just kind of missed and misunderstood because we're taking it too literally ourselves, right? We're like, well, they understand sarcasm, but maybe we're just taking questions too literally, so literally that we're answering them incorrectly. So like when they look at like the ADOS scores, the ADOS is a evidence-based tool that helps us to diagnose autism. It's actually a gold standard. But like there was a study out of MIT that looked at like autistic people, right? They found that about 80% of men that they were looking at already diagnosed with autism met criteria for ADOS to be diagnosed with autism, but only half of the women did. So what are the symptoms of the other ones that are being excluded in this, and how many diagnoses are being missed, right? And like what's the impact of that?
Yes, there is a lot of new information that we are learning over time. And when this comes out, it looks very sensationalized because of the way that we disseminate information now, right? And so we run into some of the stigma that gets kind of perpetuated by these things. But really, the underlying importance of all of this and finding tools that are more, specific to different presentations is that the time that somebody is diagnosed is so crucial to the outcomes that they experience in life, right? If you are consistently thinking, oh my God, there's something wrong with me, but nobody's telling you, like, hey, this actually is fitting criteria for this thing, and we have an explanation and there's ways to support yourself.
Yes.
If you're having that internal presentation, basically the messaging that you get about it is whatever you tell yourself. And a lot of times that includes a shitload of shame, like constant spiraling. Why am I like this? All of these things that can lead people to have really shitty outcomes, right? Substance use disorders are huge.
Yeah.
Just being, perpetually treated for depression, low self-esteem, self-deprecating thoughts, anxieties, all of this without an actual explanation of how can I best support myself? Because again, it's not even something that needs to be fixed. It's something where we need to shift our awareness of how we function so that we can shape our world to fit the way that our brain thinks instead of trying to make it the way that it's supposed to be. And so being able to identify these things in, younger humans that are born in female bodies in a way that is meaningful enough to diagnose and give explanations is so important. And a huge part of me is like just, waiting for some type of gold standard that includes something other than what we are historically used to, because that's not doing anybody a service other than people who present exactly like the DSM says without any imagination outside of that box that they give.
Yeah. And let's stop looking at the DSM like the Bible, because let's be honest, it's trash. And we don't have enough research. And like, what are we going to do, right? Like, we're just literally kind of like clinically like flowing through it and trying to like hear people where they're at and understand people where they're at. Like, it makes so much sense. But I'm with you. Early diagnosis.
Like illustrative and not exhaustive.
Yes.
This makes way too much room for interpretation and way too much room for providers' own bias to be in there, right?
That's
And that just again perpetuates that same shit over and over.
all the bias, dude. All the bias. I'm with you. So that's a wrap for today's episode of Brain Trash. We just pretty much like scratch the surface of kind of like how autism can present for people and how it's overlooked and how provider bias can get in the way and impair somebody's ability to have a strong, thorough assessment for autism that is fair to them and representative of kind of like their lived experience, right? So if any of this hit home for you, if you're rethinking how you see autism, if you want to take a deeper dive into learning more about neurodivergence and like start questioning your own signet, we'd like to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment. If you're watching on YouTube, let's go ahead and hit subscribe, follow us for our next episode. If you're on TikTok, you can follow me at Dr. Maria Ngala there. Let us know what resonated with you. And if you're a clinician, honestly, like really please start challenging yourself to look beyond the stereotypes, because like there are so many different nuanced presentations, and we need to start having awareness to look at those to provide better care for people and more validating care for people. So make sure you're subscribed. Don't miss any future episodes. If you're here for brain trash, the deep dives, the drama, how much the DSM sucks, all of it, just to validate your own weirdness, like we're here for it. So we appreciate you. Until next time, keep questioning, learning, and remember that like you're not broken. It's probably just like the system's really fucked up. So thanks, guys.